I disagree because after using social media, people can actually interact better with other people around them, which is an improvement in social skills. For example, when I was about 20, social media came out, Facebook came out, and I found out that Facebook gave me a lot of interesting topics to share with my loved ones. Moreover, when influencers talked about their sad stories, I was able to identify whether my loved ones were going through the same troubles. So I was able to intervene earlier and help them in a very tangible ways. Moreover, when my friends shared the status update, I could also keep up with them and start conversations with them. So I would say my social skills have definitely improved.
Did you hear Rachel's proposal about adding shuttle buses from the dorms to campus?
Yeah, I don't think it's a good idea, though I understand why she suggested it.
What do you mean?
Well, she's right that walking in bad weather can be really uncomfortable. I've been caught in heavy rain myself, and it was miserable. But instead of spending money on buses, the university could provide small rain shelters along the main walkways. That would make the trip easier without the high cost of hiring drivers and running vehicles every day.
I see.
As for her safety point, I don't really agree. There just aren't many cars on campus, and bicycles don't pose much of a threat either. When I walk to class, the main problem isn't cars. It's that the sidewalks are crowded. People bump into each other or step onto the grass to get by. Adding buses wouldn't fix that at all. In fact, it might make traffic worse by putting more vehicles on the road.
A student proposes that the university add shuttle buses between dorms and the main campus. However, the woman disagrees. She does not think it's a good idea. First of all, she agrees that walking in bad weather costs a lot of time and energy for students, but she thinks the school should provide rain shelters between the dorms and the main campus instead. This will make the trips easier, and it won't add high costs for the university. Secondly, the woman mentions that traffic from personal cars and bikes is not really a big issue. To elaborate, she says that there aren't many cars on campus. The bikes aren't real threats either. She believes the main problem is the crowded sidewalk. And plus, she says that if the university add the shuttle buses, it will only make the traffic situation worse. It will create more traffic and will not reduce traffic congestions. That's why the woman disagrees with the proposal and thinks the school should provide rain shelters instead. How do you pronounce this? Allelopathy? Unusual chemical reaction between, is a unusual chemical interaction between plants. Release biochemical compound into the soil, improve growth of others. All right. Listening.
When I was younger, I used to help my grandfather in his small garden each summer. He loved growing vegetables, but he often complained about one plant that caused him trouble. That plant was black walnut, a tall tree with wide branches that looked harmless to me at the time. However, it made his gardening much more difficult than I first understood. At first, he noticed that tomatoes planted near the walnut tree would never grow properly. They sprouted quickly, but their leaves soon wilted and turned yellow, even though they had enough water and sunlight. Other plants like beans and peppers also showed strange stunted growth when placed in that part of the garden. This problem confused him because he carefully fertilized and cared for all his plants equally. The trigger for understanding came when he read an article in a local farming magazine. It explained that black walnut trees release a chemical from their roots called juglone, which interferes with the development of many garden plants. That discovery made sense of the pattern he had been observing for years. The problem was not poor soil or careless watering. It was the walnut tree itself. This process clearly demonstrated the ecological concept of allelopathy. The walnut tree produced a substance that entered the soil, limiting the growth of other species. Instead of competing directly for sunlight or water, the tree reduced its competition chemically. This allowed it to maintain a wide area of influence where only certain tolerant plants could thrive successfully. Eventually, my grandfather learned to adapt his gardening strategies. He avoided planting sensitive vegetables near the walnut tree and instead grew crops farther away. By recognizing how allelopathy worked, he adjusted his planting choices and achieved a healthier, more balanced garden overall.
Okay, better results. Okay, sorry. Allelopathy is an unusual chemical interaction between plants. Some plants release biochemical compound in the surroundings and influence the growth of other plants. And the professor explains it with one example. First, he mentions a black walnut tree. This tree gave his grandfather a lot of trouble. It made gardening very difficult. To be more specific, the professor mentions that tomatoes didn't grow well around that tree. The leaves turned yellow, although the tomatoes had enough sunlight. Other plants around that tree also didn't grow well. After reading some farming magazines, his grandfather found out that the black walnut tree was releasing chemicals and disrupting the growth of other plants. It wasn't because of the poor soil at all. So after he understood this, he avoided planting sensitive plants around that tree. He also planted crops very far away from that tree. As a result, he achieved better farming outcome.
In textiles, then later in transportation and manufacturing. Each new invention not only boosted output, but also reshaped labor and social organization. To understand this process, let's look at two examples that reveal different sides of industrial change. The spinning jenny, invented by James Hargreaves in 1764, revolutionized textile production. It allowed one worker to spin multiple threads at the same time, replacing older wheels that handled only one. As a result, cloth could be produced faster and at lower cost. Families who once worked at home saw their tasks move into factories, where machines required large spaces and supervision. This shift meant greater efficiency, but also reduced independence for many rural households. In fact, critics argued that machines devalued traditional skills, even as they created cheaper goods for wider markets. Several decades later, the assembly line, most famously used by Henry Ford in the early 1900s, transformed automobile production. Instead of workers building an entire car individually, tasks were broken into small, repeated steps. Each worker added one component as the car moved along a conveyor. This method drastically cut production time and reduced prices, making cars affordable for ordinary families. However, the work became monotonous since employees repeated the same motion all day. While efficiency rose, many workers complained about fatigue and lack of creativity. Together, these two examples show that industrial change often produced trade-offs: greater speed and lower cost on one side, but also new social challenges on the other.
The professor explains two technological changes in industrial history. First, she mentions the spinning jenny. To be more specific, it revolutionized textile production. It allowed one worker to spin multiple threads, so tasks were moved from homes to factories. This was a great improvement in efficiency, But some critics argued that this devalued traditional skills. Nevertheless, it created cheaper prices for goods. Secondly, the professor mentions the assembly line. In the past, cars were built by individual workers, but after the assembly line was introduced, the process was broken down into smaller steps. This made cars more affordable. This is because workers repeated the same motion, and this lowered manufacturing costs. But it created fatigue for the workers. Workers complained that there was a lack of creativity. It was a trade-off between this new technology and social impact. That's how the professor explains